Hey, welcome back. This is Dan, and welcome to the new Underground Railroad. I was going to talk to you today a little bit about some lesser known Southern history. And this is kind of a compilation of different locations and different time periods. But you may find it interesting idea. Well, in the late 1600s, there was a king over in France, Louis. They called him the Sun King, and to date, he's the longest sitting monarch that's ever been. He was around for a long time. And in the early 1700s, Europe generally went through a period of colonial expansion. And generally speaking, this is when the kingdoms of England, France, Spain, and to some degree Portugal, they tried to expand their their empire through establishing colonies in places that had not long been discovered and explored, or really not explored much at all. But this French king, King Louis, he sent a bunch of guys to the area today that's called Canada. And they hit the East Coast and they went west and they started exploring and setting up colonies. And they tried several times and it failed, at least probably 3 times for sure. Other efforts, it's not clear, how much they tried or how much trouble that they had doing it. But they were able to do that at Quebec and at Montreal and set up actual colonies that actually functioned and survived. Well, they called all that New France, since it was just that. It was a new place for France, New France. Well, in the course of that, they ran into what the Canadians call First Nations, which, the Americans call that Native Americans. Some people call them Indians. That's what we called them for the longest, but they're trying to be politically correct now, whatever flavor that is. But anyway, the folks that were inhabiting everything before Europeans came over. And the French up there in New France, the soldiers and the colonists, they had different degrees of, fellowship with the originals that were there. And sometimes they would have problems and battles and skirmishes with them, and sometimes they would get along. But in the course of all that, they wanted to go south once they got out west so far, and they sent a guy named LaSalle and his soldiers to go down the Mississippi River basin, okay? And LaSalle and his detachment, they did just that. They left from around the lower part of Canada and came down into the Mississippi River Valley and its tributaries, and then explored the Mississippi River, and they went all the way down to the Gulf Coast. And you might have seen in another video that I made that they had the first Catholic Mass on the Mississippi River near Natchez, Mississippi. But they made it all the way to the coast, and meanwhile, at the same time, and shortly thereafter, they started sending ships across the Atlantic to go to places like Pensacola and Mobile and past Christian and Ocean Springs and New Orleans. And they were trying to set up colonies in these locations. And now the panhandle of what is today Florida was on paper controlled by the Spanish. And the Spanish did their own exploring too, and they sent a guy named Hernando de Soto to explore and claim land for Spain, which New Spain. But on paper, what is today the panhandle of Florida was controlled by the Spanish. Well, the French came and they went to Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and they were at past Christian, Mississippi, and of course it's well known about New Orleans, which a lot of folks don't know this, but it was Spanish really before it was theirs. But at Mobile, they were able to successfully set up a colony there, and they built a fort there. And now this is not in the same location that the city of Mobile is today. It was about 25 miles upriver of where Mobile, Alabama is today. And they set up a fort there, and the king, remember the king back over in France? Well, he sent soldiers over to help the colonists at Mobile protect themselves. And the reason for this is because, like I told you before, on paper it was controlled by the Spanish, or it was Spanish territory. Well, Mobile, Alabama is right at Mobile Bay in the Gulf of Mexico. And what was going on is the colonists were being harassed periodically, and they were always under threat from the Spanish and from pirates who would come in from the Gulf and park their ships and hop out and go around looting and robbing and making problems for everybody. And the colonists were just really trying to live in a new place and, trying to get set up and have a better life, just like anybody really that moves. But because they were under threat all the time like that, the king sent soldiers over to Mobile to help protect them. Well, back over in France, there was a young guy. He was a teenager, and his name was Jean-Baptiste LeFleur. And he was a young man, or in his late teens, you could say, and he tended horses for the king in the stables. So he was kind of a stable boy, you might say. But he was in the army, and he ended up coming over on a ship on behalf of King Louis to go to Mobile and help protect these colonists. Well, when he got over to Mobile, he found that there was a fort there, and in the course of things, he met a girl and married her. And I think they had a kid, maybe. But it wasn't too long after that she died. Well, Jean-Baptiste LeFleur, this Frenchman, this guy in the army, he met another girl there that was a native to Mobile, so she had been born there. And she was the daughter of kind of the quartermaster of the fort that was there. And this is the kind of guy that his job is to maintain stores and supplies and make sure everything was taken care of from a logistics standpoint and supply chain management, you might say. And also during this time, the Mobile River flooded, and it messed up the fort, which was largely made out of wood and timbers, which for a hasty defense, that's fine. but it's not anything really permanent. So the decision was made to move the fort about 25 miles downriver to better protect the coast, the Mobile inhabitants, and make a more permanent establishment. And in the course of that, they built the new fort, which was made out of brick and more long-term materials. So Jean-Baptiste LeFleur, this guy, he had remarried this daughter of this quartermaster. Well, the quartermaster, the supply man, who was also in the army, one of his other duties was that he knew how to navigate the ships and flat-bottom boats and keel boats, they called them. And these were, I mean, almost you might want to call them like a barge, really. And you could look it up, what a keel boat is, or a flat-bottom boat. But anyway, he knew how to do that, and he was in charge of the boats that were going around along the coast and around to New Orleans and up the river a little bit, and he knew how to do that well. So his father-in-law taught him how to handle keel boats and these flat-bottom boats to carry supplies. This is how the quartermaster was getting his supplies, and he needed to know that. And he taught Jean-Baptiste LeFleur how to handle those boats. Well, a few years after he had married this man's daughter, they had 3 more children. And one of those children was a guy named Louis LeFleur, okay? And as time went on, Louis got a little older, and he was a teenager, and he got where he could take instruction and learn things more like a man. Well, Jean-Baptiste took his son Louis, in the same way he had learned from his father-in-law. He taught Louis how to handle flat-bottom boats and keel boats and move supplies and handle men and cargo. And Louis took off to it. He really took to it and did well. And he started doing that more or less full time. And they would get supplies from ships at ports, and this would be along the Florida Panhandle and Pensacola and at Mobile and Ocean Springs and past Christian and Biloxi, Mississippi. And Louis and his guys, they would load up their boats, these flat-bottom boats, and some of them had sails too, by the way. So they could move by the wind, and they could navigate with these oar-looking things. They served kind of as a oar, but also like a rudder. And you could set them out on the side of the boat and keep the boat from tipping over in the event of high wind. So you could still use the wind, but not have your boat tip over. And if you got it full of stuff, you don't want that to happen. But these boats I'm talking about, they were not little dories or canoes or anything like that. Some of these boats were, 60 or 70 feet long, and sometimes they could have a crew of 25 men, depending on how big the boat was. So these were not little toys. And Louis had learned how to do this well from his dad, and of course Jean-Baptiste had learned from his father-in-law. Well, there was a trading company that was given a charter by the king. I'm drawing a blank now what the name of the company was, but they were given a charter to be pretty much the sole provider of supplies to the French and the French colonies, and generally anybody who was willing or wanted to trade. And Louis was operating some of those boats. He had his own business now, working for this, I want to say it was Pratt, P-R-A-T-T. It was like a 3 last name business, chartered by the king. So Louis Louis started moving supplies, and he'd move them around along the coast and then to New Orleans and then on upriver, up the Mississippi River to Natchez and to Vicksburg. And also he would navigate up the Pearl River. And, generally any kind of trading post that he could go and sell the supplies that he had gotten. Well, at this time, the practice of the day was to get furs. Okay, this was a big deal. Was furs. This is before the cotton boom, and before anybody had discovered how lucrative cotton could be. They were getting furs, and they would take these furs down on these flat bottom boats, going the other way, going down river, and they would go to places like Vicksburg or Natchez or New Orleans or places along the coast even, and they would sell these furs. And not only would they sell the furs, but they would sell the boat for lumber. Now, I want you to keep in mind now the expense and the labor that went into one of these flat bottom boats. They didn't go down to Bass Pro Shops and buy one of these boats. They didn't get it from Academy or none of that, or Cabela's off the internet. No. They actually cut trees down and they sawed the trees into lumber by hand, and then took the lumber that they made to build these boats. That's a lot of work, It's a lot invested in one of these things. So it was very important to them. And what it was made of was important to them too, and that was the lumber. And valuable to settlers who were trying to establish themselves and build some kind of domicile or cabin or house. Well, when they would get down to these locations, not only would they sell the furs, but they'd sell the wood also for lumber, and they would get money. And at the time, the money that was in common use was what they call specie, which is metal money, gold and silver. And the kind of money that you wanted, today the U.S. dollar is considered the world's reserve currency, or the one that's in demand, that's considered the most stable and stuff like that. Well, at that time, the one that you wanted was the Spanish milled dollar, and they were Spanish silver coins. That's what they were. So these folks would sell their stuff, and then they would travel back up where they came from. And one of the main ways that they did this was on horseback and on a road that's today a federal landmark called the Natchez Trace. And the Natchez Trace is a road that they really don't know how old it is. It was traveled on foot by Native Americans or First Nations or Indians, those folks, on foot for thousands of years, and they really don't even know how old it is. Later, folks had wagons, and they would use wagons and horses to go through there. And then later they started having cars, and people started driving cars on this road. Well, at a certain point, which I believe is in the 1930s, under FDR, when all these national parks were formed, the Natchez Trace, the road itself, was named as a possession of the National Park Service, and they paved it and made it a protected thing. And that road goes, generally speaking, it meanders and goes along water and open areas and wooded areas as you pass through. But it goes between Natchez and Nashville, Natchez, Mississippi, and Nashville, Tennessee. So trade will be going up and down the Natchez Trace, okay? Well, Old Louis, he was on to all that. He was a regular businessman by this time, and he was starting to be a little bit of a baller. So he thought, well, I'm going to make a place, and he did. He made a place on the Natchez Trace that was like an inn, okay? A place for somebody to spend the night and get a little bit of grub if they were hungry, not much, but just something to kind of tide them over, and a place to spend the night. And he did that, and then he also made this a place that the guys that were bringing the mail, that when they were transporting the mail, they could stop there and get fresh horses and spend the night and eat a little bit, like I said. And travelers could stay there too. This is a place that is called French Camp. French Camp. And it's pretty far from most things, you know. It's remote, and I guess that's probably Louis' reasoning for establishing it there, because it is remote, and the guys with the mail will need fresh horses, and folks will be tired and stuff like that. Well, old Louis, he ended up having 2 wives that were Choctaw. And shockingly, at least to me it is, they were sisters. Now, this is because there was a guy that had this is a whole nother story, but there was a guy that had a wife that was a niece of Pushmataha. And he had a daughter by her. And the guy that was married to the niece of Pushmataha was a white man of English descent named Roscoe Cole. Roscoe Cole. And he married this woman, and she was Choctaw. And it was said that she was very beautiful, and that she could influence events and even stop fights or arguments or battles just for her beauty. But he had Mr. Cole, Roscoe Cole. He had married her, and they had a daughter. And their daughter, they had a few kids actually, but one of their daughters married a man that was of French descent. This is all in the same area around French Camp, okay? Well, this man was of French descent, and his last name was Cravat. Cravatt, Cravat. And Mr. Cravat, this Frenchman, he traded with the Choctaws and the Chickasaw, and which, by the way, this man's father-in-law, Roscoe Cole, there's a record of him being in Virginia, and there was 2 tribes that were fighting in Virginia, and a 3rd tribe. Well, it was the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, and they had been off and on warring with each other, but they teamed up against this 3rd tribe, and they came in the middle of the night and basically annihilated this entire tribe and killed all of them, with the exception of a few refugees. And over in Virginia, when they collected the refugees, or the POWs, this white man, Roscoe Cole, was among this tribe. And somehow he ended up being around French Camp on the Natchez Trace over in Mississippi. It's unknown how that happened. But him and his beautiful wife, and I've seen a painting of her, and I don't know, it's a painting, you know, it's an artist's rendering, but she was with a beauty to her. She was probably striking at the time with her beauty. But they had a daughter who married this Cravat man, this Frenchman, okay? So Mr. Cravat and his wife had 2 daughters, and for I don't know how, but Pushmataha was still alive, the chief, okay? And Mr. Cravat was about to go over what is in today, modern day Alabama, to trade with the Chickasaw. And for reasons unknown, he entrusted his 2 daughters, which were Nancy and Rebecca, okay? He gave them white folks' names, I guess. But he entrusted them to the care of Pushmataha, okay? Before he went over into what's Alabama today to trade with the Chickasaw. And maybe it was sketchy, and that's why he did that. I'm not real sure. But it is recorded that he died less than a year later over there. So maybe he knew that it was rough country or dangerous, and that's why he wanted his daughters taken care of. But so he was gone. You know, the girls were in the care of Pushmataha, and I don't know how Louis, the guy with the flat bottom boats and the trading posts on the trace for fresh horses and all, I don't know how he met these girls or these young ladies, but he did, and he took them off of Pushmataha's hands, and these were sisters. You can call them Choctaw, but that's not really true, because these girls were mixed, okay? They were mixed Choctaw, they were mixed French, and they were mixed British. So they were not full-blood Choctaw. But he must have thought they were pretty or desirable or something, because he took them off Pushmataha's hands. And he married one of them down there in Mobile. I guess he took them on the boat with him or down the trace or wherever he was going. He was doing well by this point. But they were Choctaw sisters or mixed race sisters. And in all his thriving entrepreneurship that he was doing, he also set up a place off the banks of the Pearl River, okay, up on some high bluffs that were out of the flood plain in the flood area of the Pearl River. Now, if you go to Jackson, Mississippi, you can see where that place was, because now it's the place where the Capitol, the old Capitol, is. That was the capital of the state and the legislature until a little bit beyond the Civil War. But that thing wasn't there at this time. This was Louis LeFleur's land up here on these bluffs. And he did well there too. He set up a homestead, he built fences, and he had all sorts of animals. And he's credited with introducing cattle to the area. So imagine, on his flat bottom boats, he was also bringing cows, you know. But he set up a place on the west banks of the Pearl River in what is today Jackson, Mississippi, and set up a place there. Well, he had a son by Rebecca, and I know that's weird. He was married to sisters, and I thought at one point, well, maybe he was just kind of taking care of them, and there wasn't nothing questionable going on. But he actually had kids by both of these women, these sisters. But one of his sons that was born by, I believe, Rebecca, was a boy, and his name was Greenwood LeFleur. Now, around Jackson, Mississippi, they have a area in a state park that they call LeFleur's Bluff. It's not where his homestead was, but they have some things named after him over there. But his son, Louis LeFleur's son, when Greenwood was about 10 years old, they moved from LeFleur's Bluff, the folks called it, in Jackson, Mississippi, on the west banks of the Pearl River, and they took up their things and they moved up to French Camp, and they lived there. I think for the duration, really, at least until Louis passed away. But Greenwood LeFleur, which there's pictures, well, not pictures, but paintings of him. Greenwood LeFleur was the last Choctaw Nation chief. He had kind of a peculiar look based on the paintings. You could tell he wasn't all the way white or all the way Choctaw, but he had facial features of both. And he was the last chief of the Choctaw Nation, okay? And he ended up building a house around Carrollton, Mississippi, which was a gigantic mansion. I would have loved to see this thing, but it doesn't exist now. Within my lifetime, it caught fire. But the name of this mansion, they say it was the biggest mansion in the South, and this was Greenwood LeFleur. This was his house, the son of Louis, the chief, the last chief of the Choctaw Nation. And he built this house, and the house had a name. The name of this house was Malmaison. Malmaison. And his descendants lived in that house and continued to have it until, like I said, I think within my lifetime, his great granddaughters, which were old ladies, you know, they still like to party in there, and Greenwood like to party and have festivities and things there. But they were having a party there, and they were downstairs, and they heard a little bit of noise coming from upstairs, and somebody went to go check it out, and they thought somebody was up there upstairs fooling around. But they found out that a fire had broken out over there, or up there. Well, sadly, there was no water, and not enough water to put out the fire, and the whole dang thing burnt to the ground. There's renderings of it, and you know, some illustrations of what the house looked like, and I think there is a couple of pictures, but it's not much. The outbuildings, a couple of the outbuildings survived, and they're still there, is my understanding, but the house itself is gone. So, Jean-Baptiste LeFleur, the stable boy over there for the king in France. He came over to help those folks in Mobile protect themselves, and he married a quartermaster's daughter. He learned to travel and operate keel boats and flat-bottom boats, and he taught his son Louis. And Louis went on to become prosperous with the boats and with supplies and making money. And he built a homestead off the west bank of the Pearl River in Jackson, Mississippi, above the floodplain. He introduced cattle to the area, and he set up a trading post called French Camp on the Natchez Trace. He married 2 Choctaw wives and had children by them. And one of his sons was Greenwood LeFleur, the last chief of the Choctaw Nation. Well, to sum it up, at the end, I will tell you this. French Camp, I'm not sure who owned it exactly, but in 1885, some Christian folks that were of Scottish and Irish descent that were associated with a Presbyterian church around French Camp, they took possession of that, and they set up an academy, a finishing school for girls, okay? And it did so well to teach these girls etiquette and, prepare them for being a wife, I guess. It did so well that about a year later they started another one for the boys, and it did well too. Well, a little while later, the one that they set up for the boys, or the girls, I forget, but I think it was the girls, because I remember thinking maybe they were trying to cook in there. But anyway, one of them burned down, and then they combined the girls and the boys academy. And today, French Camp Academy is a real thing, and they take in young people that have limited opportunities, and they may be orphans or in some similar circumstance, and they get them all the way through high school and get them to graduate and help them get jobs and do all that, teach them how to do things for the family and with their hands. And it's a good thing, and you can donate to it if you want to. French Camp Academy. If I remember, maybe I'll put the link down below so you can try to donate or something like that if you want to. But it's still a real thing. Anyway, check out French Camp sometime when you get a chance. Check out the cabins, and you can spend the night there too if you want to. But there's no internet and there's no TV. Hope you're doing well, and we'll see you next time.